Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Um, this session, we want to make it very interactive, and if you look at the Menti platform, you'll see there's a couple of questions that we've asked where we want to get, we really want to get your input. Um, I think one of the questions is a kind of a yes/no question, but you don't need to say yes or no. Only you can also motivate why you're saying yes or no. And then a couple of other questions are kind of questions where we ask you really to kind of to think a little bit about what it is that you want to say. This topic is in terms of the food value chain has become quite important over the last while, especially since COVID-19 has resulted in lockdowns in certain, well, in just about every country throughout the world, basically, resulting in people losing jobs and depending more on food kitchens and other forms of sustenance. So in some areas, we've also seen a growth in food gardens as poor people realize that they have to try and find ways to feed themselves in the cheapest possible manner. Um, it raises questions. This session, we will talk about the role of agriculture in Africa. Have we done enough as government, business, and civil society to exploit the potential of agriculture as a way of feeding our people and as a way of raising revenue to pay possibly for other stuff also that we need to do. But so before we, there's a large panel of speakers. What we are going to do is we're going to ask everyone to make some opening remarks, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A after that. So if there are people who want to ask the questions, we look at the questions, and we will try to address all the questions. If we don't address all the questions, we will get back to them later. Again, the code for this session is 3581562. And so let me just call up our first panelist. It's Bennie Van Rooy, the CEO of Grobank, and I believe that Grobank has kindly also sponsored this session. So over to you, Bennie.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. As an individual and both a it's exciting to be associated with this specific event. Tolly and I have been working for quite a while to ensure we can make it possible. And it's extremely appropriate for Grobank to be part of the Grand Africa event because an announcement was made last week where Access Bank of Nigeria announced that transaction subject to regulatory approval, where Access Bank would acquire an interest in Grobank, and Grobank's name would be changed in the not too distant future to Access Bank South Africa, again subject to regulatory approvals. And Access Bank of Africa will then become part of a significant large pan-African banking group. Very exciting developments. It's the first time in the history of South Africa that a African-owned bank is acquiring ownership in a local South African bank. Obviously, there's multiple opportunities in the commercial space to participate in cross-border transactions, foreign currency transactions, to support clients that are operating in multiple African countries. And those are one of the aspects which I will address a little bit later on, insofar as exactly why there are a number of challenges as presented to the agricultural space across the African continent to enable it to become more of a net exporter of food commodities as opposed to the current situation being a net importer of food commodities. I've been given approximately 15 minutes for this introductory remarks, and there are a number of issues that I want to focus on. I want to specifically focus on a food value chain and why is it important to have a food value chain in place. Post that, I'll just show a bit of statistics on food consumption and population in Africa and why there are certain opportunities presented to the African agricultural space. And finally, we'll end off with a few challenges and opportunities for the African agricultural space and what we can expect over the next few years from an agricultural development perspective. So a food value chain is critical, and it's critical to understand a food value chain, which starts with, and I'm going to share my screen, if I'm allowed to. Okay, my screen sharing has been disabled, so no problem from that perspective. So food value chain starts with inputs being provided to farmers, inputs in the form of seeds or fertilizer or equipment or whatever provided to farmers. So I can share my screen now. So let me do that. And let me put it on presentation mode. Okay. So this slide simplistically presents a food value chain. As I said, as I mentioned, it starts with inputs, what's necessary to get production and commodity production going. Then from inputs moves to the production side, which is the farm itself. The farm consists of a number of very important components as well, a very critical part of the value chain. To be a successful farmer, you need land, you need access to infrastructure, you need access to skills and mentoring programs. Access to water is critical, especially in our continent. And then subsequently also access to funding, especially affordable funding, and access to a mature market, a sales and distribution channel. So from farm or on-farm production, transport and logistics take support, where commodities are transported to storage and handling facilities. From there on, value-added processing takes place. There's further transport taking place from marketing distribution perspective, and finally sold and in retailers. Now there are a number of risks presented in this value chain. These risks are briefly explained on the bottom side of this specific slide. Production risk, and a number of farmers fail in the production space because of lack of affordable funding, because of inadequate access to skills and mentoring programs, inadequate skills to infrastructure. We've become quite accustomed to biological and environmental risks. In Africa specifically, lots of crops being impacted by diseases and pests, contamination of natural resources which are necessary in the production cycle, and weather-related risks. There's always some sort of either drought or other adverse weather condition taking place across the continent. Marketing risk is important because you have to be able to market food which is at a global standard or can compete with global standards. Commodities compete with the global standards. Has to be marketed in a way that the businesses can still retain their sustainability. We know that logistics and infrastructure challenges are posed right across the African continent, and then from a management risk perspective, and importantly, and that's where we need to get to from a agricultural production perspective, is to produce food that are the equivalent or that are at a global standard and that can be produced in sufficient quantities to be exported and to be sold on global markets. So critical that we need to get that right. If I then move forward to specific opportunities that we see in the food space, just a few slides on current statistics or trends that we experience. We see there's a significant and rapidly transition from rural to urbanization from a population perspective. In the year 2000, roughly a third of Africa's population was urbanized. In 2050, we expect roughly 2/3 of Africa's population to be urbanized, and that in itself creates opportunities for farmers. We also know that in the urban space, there's a much higher demand for processed food as opposed to unprocessed food in rural areas. So if we look on the left-hand side of the slide, and specifically see that the demand for highly processed foods by urban consumers. Roughly 40% of total food demand is in highly processed foods, where in the rural space, more than 70% of demand is for unprocessed food. If we look on the right-hand side, in the upper or more affluent socioeconomic segments, also clear that there's a higher demand for highly processed food. One can therefore expect that there will be a migration towards food processing to a large extent, to ensure that we can provide specifically for the demand of our continent. This slide is fascinating. Africa has never really been able to ensure that food exports exceed food imports, and I'll get to some of the reasons why this is the reality, which is a unique phenomenon, because one would assume that in the African space, that with all the fertile land available, we should be able to be a net exporter of food commodities, not a net importer of food commodities. African food imports as a percentage of total imports, it remains stable at roughly the 15% level. Clearly an opportunity to increase food production across the continent. If we look at where specifically the proportion of imports and exports by region, import perspective, significant imports into West Africa, Southern Africa, Northern Africa. From an export perspective, West Africa and Southern Africa have the lion's share of exports. So clear opportunities in other areas across the continent to increase the production of food and proportion of exports. We look at specifically what commodities are being imported into Africa. You see a major, roughly a third of all imports into Africa consists of cereals. So basic staple foods being the major contributor to imports into the continent. If we look at exports, interestingly enough, that exports are dominated by high value crops. If you look on the right hand side, cocoa, edible fruits, coffee, tea, edible vegetables, clearly we're looking at high value crops. So there's a demand for more mass production of basic staple food that being imported into the continent, whereas on the export side we see a lot of exports being allocated to high value crops. If you look at some of the challenges that we experience across the continent, clear that apologies for that. If you look at challenges that's being presented, there's really a high demand for farmers to expand and increase productivity, but a number of challenges. It's very difficult for farmers on a small scale basis, taking into account that a lot of our farmers across the continent are small scale and subsistence farmers, for small scale farmers to produce quality food at competitive prices. There's a big demand on quality control and to increase productivity and increase production. Wage competition will become more and more of a challenge as urbanization takes place. Lots of fragmented marketing challenges and market linkage challenges, with high transport costs playing a key part, weak infrastructure also playing a part. A big concern with regard to food imports across countries in Africa is the high tariff measures. We're aware of the fact that a number of countries generate significant revenue with cross-border tariffs and taxes. And if that system can't change, it will be very difficult for African countries to export to neighboring countries. Branding is a concern, and then climate change and the requirement to be flexible and adapt to climate changes will be a key challenge going forward. Access to finance is typically a big challenge for farmers, and finance is such a key part, a key component of agricultural or the agricultural production cycle, mainly because input costs and costs are incurred, or there's a big mismatch between timing that costs are incurred to produce food commodities and the timing of revenue generation when commodities are sold at various retail markets. So funding then becomes a key component. Now, what's evident is that there's a major challenge for farmers to produce collateral security to banks. Insufficient collateral that typically results, and also the next concern being raised on this slide, that of own contribution, because there are such a lot of cyclical risks in agricultural production. Funders typically require farmers to provide some sort of equity contribution, own contribution. They will hardly fund 100% of or rarely fund 100% of an agricultural project. Now, because there's lack of security and lack of own contribution, that typically results in a highly leveraged transaction, or a transaction that has excess debt and little equity from a balance sheet perspective. Because the transaction is perceived of a high risk, funders generally charge higher interest rates to over-leverage transactions. That has a significant impact on the ability of the agricultural products to be successful and sustainable because of the high cost of funding. Also, there's substantial challenges to get sufficient information, data available. Typically, small-scale farmers don't have audited financial statements or a track record and history of data available. Now, in order to address some of these funding challenges, a value chain model is important where we reduce the production risk, and I'll get to that on the next slide. So, just from an opportunity perspective, with increased urbanization and aggregation then becomes very important. Aggregation of groupings of smallholder farmers, almost in cooperative structures, become important to supply food to the increasing urban areas across the continent. Value chain approaches, as we'll refer to soon, will play a key part. Technology will become absolutely critical in improving agricultural productivity across the continent. And if I move to the value chain approach specifically, important to state that is a number of participants that we'll need in this value chain to be successful. If we want to produce quality food on a large scale of aggregation, it's important that agricultural projects are supported by technical partners and accountability partners, that there's sufficient provision for skills and knowledge transfer to the farmers, and importantly also on the right hand side, some sort of a lead partner to take care of the marketing and distribution challenges. So what we are looking for to be successful is that to establish a fund that's supported by governments or DFIs, development finance institutions, that supports a number of agricultural projects where there would be groups of smallholder farmers that can become some sort of a critical mass, supported by technical partners, accountability partners, to ensure that there's sufficient knowledge and skills transfer, sufficient monitoring taking place, and then for a lead agricultural partner to take care of, or a commercial partner to take care of off-take agreements. The agricultural space is one space that leads itself towards public-private partnerships, where government plays a role, where commercial agriculture plays a role, where DFIs play a role, where emerging subsistence smallholder farmers play a role, and where retailers play a role to ensure successful agricultural production. Now, this proposed value chain solution has been used in South Africa in a number of specific large-scale agricultural projects, where the association between the various partners, a commercial farmer and a group of subsistence smallholder farmers, have been very successful. I've already referred to the Access Bank transaction, which is a fairly new development for Grobank, and we look forward to participating not only in grain agricultural spaces of Africa. Access Bank South Africa will now be able to focus on a number of other industries as well in South Africa and in neighboring countries, but we can also play a meaningful part in agricultural growth and agricultural development across the African continent. Thank you very much for your time. That's roughly the end of my 15 minutes time allocation.
Thank you. Thank you, Benny. We are running a little bit behind time, so I will try to speed up with no long introductions. So we will move on immediately to our next speaker, who is the only panelist who's in the room with me. It's Dr. Ivan Meyer, the Provincial Minister of Agriculture in the Western Cape Provincial Government. Welcome, sir.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Solly. Thank you for the opportunity to address this meeting. I'm particularly happy also to see my friend,